It's a great pleasure and honor to be here, and it's wonderful that we have a linked conference with this heady material, and then we have practical work on making things, and that combination seems to me the most enriching kind. And actually, Andy Rotman, who I'm going to introduce, is someone who has worked on these relationships between storytelling and art and moral and social systems. So I'm very excited to hear what he has to say. Andy is an associate professor of religion at Smith College, and he's worked on narratives and images in South Asia, looking at them as part of social history and material culture. His two publications that I would mention, one deals with narrative. He has edited the first of a two-part translation of the Divine Stories. I won't pretend to say it in Sanskrit, which is one of the most important collections of ancient Buddhist narratives, and is the first volume in a series on the classics of Indian Buddhism that's published by Wisdom Publications. So that should be very exciting. And the other is a book that I am going to go out and read right away, because it's on the visual, how thus I have seen, visualizing faith in early Indian Buddhism. And it discusses how seeing and faith function as part of overlapping visual and moral systems.
Thank you very much to the organizers and to all of you for coming here and listening so attentively. I like turning around and watching people taking notes and paying such close attention. That makes speaking all the more fun. Today I have prepared remarks, so I'll be reading 25 minutes or so. It helps me focus when I'm reading something. We can learn quite a bit about Buddhist understandings of hospitality by examining one of the terms frequently found in Indian Buddhist Sanskrit texts and commonly translated as hospitality. The term atiti satkara means doing kara, something good or virtuous, sat, for a guest, atiti. This etymology raises two interesting questions for an investigation into Buddhist ideas of hospitality. First, what constitutes a good deed, satkara? This is a crucial question for Buddhist ethics. Second, what do we mean by guest? The term atiti has a complex etymological history with important implications for Vedic and astrological studies, but two etymologies are most common, and both of them are illuminating. We can understand the term as deriving from the Sanskrit root at, which means to go constantly, to walk, to wander. Hence, someone who is atiti is on the move. He or she isn't a permanent resident in one home. Rather, that person is a visitor, one who is passing through. Atiti, however, can also be understood as the antonym of titi, which denotes a specific time, an auspicious one at that. In this sense, atiti refers to one who has no fixed time for coming, or one who has arrived outside the auspicious lunar days. In other words, it refers to someone who has arrived unexpectedly, at a random time, or worse, at the wrong time. Though there is an abundance of material in Buddhism about planned giving, what to give to the monastic community, where to give it, when to give it, and how much merit such offerings will generate for the donor, the category of unplanned giving has received less attention. Yet, this category of unplanned giving is addressed explicitly in Buddhist narrative literature. Accounts in these materials of Buddhist laymen and laywomen interacting with Buddhist monks, who all too often arrive unexpectedly and at what seems to be the wrong time, form a template for Buddhist hospitality more generally. Even today, among Indians of all faiths, there is a common saying, Atiti Devo Bhava. The Atiti, the guest, is God. I've heard this said by my friends and teachers in India, whether Buddhist, Hindu, or Jain, when I or someone else arrived unexpectedly and tea and biscuits were quickly conjured. I've also heard this said by strangers on trains and buses when they share food with me or I with them. The way one treats a guest, I've been told, says a lot about one's relationship with the divine. While writing about the logic and practice of Hindu worship in central India, Lawrence Babb explains the entire sequence that constitutes puja, worship, has one overall purpose: to make the god or goddess feel like a welcome guest. Worshipping the god or goddess is a form of hospitality, and hospitality is a form of worship. Hence, the atithi is to be treated as a god. But what does one do when an atithi, a guest, arrives, someone who has come unexpectedly at an inopportune time? What actions in such a situation are virtuous? What, in the end, are the component parts of hospitality? In addressing these questions, I will consider a number of stories from the Divyavadana. That's the way you pronounce it. Divine stories.
I was just testing you.
The text is a vast compendium of Indian Buddhist narratives written in Sanskrit in the early centuries of the Common Era. Its stories have since spread throughout Asia as both narrative and narrative art, leaving an indelible mark on Buddhist thought and practice. Many of these stories were incorporated into the monastic code of the branch of Buddhists known as the Mula Sarvastivadins, and this canonical text was later transmitted to Tibet, China, and beyond. As a result, scores of generations of Buddhists in Asia have considered these stories, the word of the Buddha, Buddha Vachana, and have repeatedly recited, reworked, painted, and sculpted them. These are, in short, some of the most influential stories in the history of Buddhism. Many of the stories in the Divyavadana feature accounts of people who, suddenly and unexpectedly, meet up with the Buddha, one of the senior monks in his order, such as Mahakashyapa, Mahakatyayana, and Mahamoggallana, or a solitary Buddha, an awakened being like the Buddha, but who doesn't found his own monastic community. All of these figures are arhats, a term that comes from the Sanskrit root ar, meaning to be worthy or to deserve. An arhat, therefore, is someone who is worthy and deserving. But worthy and deserving of what? The answer, according to the Divyavadana, is that they're worthy and deserving of offerings, dakshineya, food offerings in particular, by Buddhists and non-Buddhists alike. An arhat is a particularly good field of merit, punya kshetra, for devotees to plant an offering. Thus, as one scholar notes, any good or bad action directed towards such a being can have positive or negative karmic results beyond all expectations. In the story of Mendaka, for example, during a famine, with stocks of food nearly depleted, the householder Mendaka, his wife, son, daughter-in-law, and servant, and maid, happen to meet a solitary Buddha, and each of them give him the last bit of food that they possess. They then make fervent aspirations for more food, all of which are immediately fulfilled. When the king hears of this, he exclaims, quote, "Oh, this field is so fertile and faultless. A seed sown today bears fruit today as well." Since the solitary Buddha constitutes a particularly fecund field of merit, the karmic results of their respective offerings are obtained on the same day. As the Buddha explains, if monks, beings were to know the result of charity and the consequence of offering charity, as I know the result of charity and the consequence of offering charity, then at present they would never eat the very last remaining mouthful of food without giving it away or sharing it, if a worthy recipient of that food were to be found. Intrinsic to these encounters is an exchange. Lay people offer food to monastics, and monastics in turn offer these lay people merit. This food for merit exchange is made explicit in the story of Saddhisodgata. A solitary Buddha who is traveling through the countryside arrives at a park on the outskirts of town, but then decides to go elsewhere. A householder happens to see him and says, "Noble one, why are you turning back? You are in want of food, and I of merit. Take up residence here in the park, and I'll support you with alms with no interruption." But there is a problem. Solitary Buddhas, such as the story of Mendaka and the story of Saddhisodgata, cannot be sought out as the recipients of offerings. They live in remote areas, as the texts tell us, and they like to roam, following the famous prescription in the Pali Suttas, and they like to, quote, wander alone like a rhinoceros. It is their offering to the laity that they come and accept the laity's offerings, providing them a chance to transform their gifts into merit. Moreover, in addition to living in remote areas, Buddhist monks of all kinds tended to be on the move. In the era before permanent monastic settlements, which probably occurred in the early centuries of the Common Era, monks would walk and wander, viharati, for 9 months of the year, and then settle somewhere for the 3 months of the rainy season, when travel was difficult, to study and meditate. These settlements came to be known as viharas, since they were places in which monastics could do just what they did when it wasn't raining: live, pass time, and to be sure, walk about. The walkabout component of their lives was crucial. Monastics have always been dependent on the largesse of the laity for their food. And during this period of Buddhist monasticism, monastics would normally go on an alms round each day to find food for themselves. This was the case whether they were wandering the countryside or settled in a vihara. They would wander from home to home, generally without predestination, until their bowls were full, accepting whatever food they happened to receive. That was their main food for the day. Although lay people could make arrangements to invite the Buddha or the full monastic community to one's home for a meal, a practice amenable to the very rich, such as kings, but out of the question for the poor and middle class, one could not invite a single monk to one's home, at least not according to the earliest strata of material. One could not, therefore, simply invite a senior-most monk to one's home and feed him, even though he was worthy of offerings. Moreover, those spiritually advanced monks who were arhats were often the most peripatetic. They would wander constantly from one region to the next, not domesticated by monastic structures. This left the average layperson in a quandary. How could someone of ordinary means afford to feed the entire monastic community, or just find a single monk to feed, especially one who was eminently worthy? The Divyavadana offers no easy answers, nor do other Indian Buddhist texts. There simply aren't many chances for a layperson to make food offerings. What is stressed, however, is that one should make the most of any such opportunity that arises, even if one isn't particularly prepared to do a good deed for the guest who suddenly appears. Some of the most famous stories in Indian Buddhism address this problem. Probably the most famous of all concerns King Ashoka, the great Indian monarch from the 3rd century BCE, whose empire stretched from present-day Afghanistan to Bangladesh, and whose conversion to Buddhism and righteous rule are still remembered through his famous pillar inscriptions. The life of King Ashoka is told in great detail in the Divyavadana, stretching back to a previous life of Ashoka, when he was a boy named Jaya in the city of Rajagriha, and extending to his last days when, imprisoned by his heir apparent son, he gave away all his possessions to the monastic community. Central to this narrative is the offering he made when he was the boy named Jaya, for we are told that this very offering culminated in his becoming a great monarch, and in the end, a great patron of Buddhism. As we read in the story of a gift of dirt, tells you something in advance. Quote, "The Blessed One arrived at the main road in Rajagriha. 2 little boys were there. One was a son from a very prominent family, and the other a son from a somewhat less prominent family. They were playing at building houses in the dirt. The first of them was named Jaya, victory, and the second was named Vijaya, conquest. Both of them saw the Buddha, who was adorned with the 32 marks of a great man, and who was a sight one never tires of seeing. The young boy Jaya, thinking, 'I'll give him some barley meal,' threw a handful of dirt into the Blessed One's begging bowl. Vijaya approved of this by respectfully folding his hands together. As it is said, he saw the greatly compassionate self-made one, whose body radiated a halo a fathom wide. With a resolute face and stilled with faith, he offered some dirt to the one who brings an end to birth and old age. After making this offering to the Blessed One, Jaya then proceeded to make a fervent aspiration. By this root of virtue, may I become king, and after placing the earth under a single umbrella of sovereignty, may I serve the Lord Buddha. The sage perceived the boy's disposition, and knowing that his fervent aspiration was proper, saw that the desired result would be attained because of the power of his field of merit. He therefore accepted with compassion the proffered dirt. And so that seed of merit was to ripen into Ashoka's kingship. And so that seed of merit that was to ripen into Ashoka's kingship was planted. End of quote. There are some notable features of this story that tell us a lot about Buddhist notions of hospitality. First, the intention of the giver is important. Ashoka, in his former incarnation as Jaya, sets the intention to give some barley meal as an offering, even though he has none to give, and instead offers the Buddha a handful of dirt. Dirt is not food, and as such, the gift has very little utility. Yet Jaya had a good disposition, bhava, in large part, no doubt, because he is blessed with faith. Faith is like the price of admission into the system of Buddhist morality. Not faith in Buddhist morality per se, but the faith that admits and empowers one as a Buddhist. Faith is the seed money that allows one to invest in a Buddhist future. It allows one to buy in, creating the possibility for spiritual growth. To use the analogy of a card game, faith is like the chips one receives to ante up for the first hand. While one can perform good or bad deeds without faith, one does so not as a Buddhist, and the rewards are limited. To be a Buddhist, faith is a requisite, and once one has faith, one can participate in the Buddhist moral economy, readily accruing moral value through good deeds. The value of the deed that Jaya has performed is apparent by the success of his fervent aspiration, pranidhana, which the Buddha affirms as being right or proper, samyak. The accrued merit from the offering is both root and capital, the basis for future good deeds and attainments, and the purchase power for current ones. Roots of virtue, one scholar explains, are like roots, mula, because once performed, they remain as the basis for future virtue, and if properly cultivated, grow, mature, and bear fruit. In this case, as our narrator, the Buddha, explains, Jaya's offering functioned as a root that helped him develop into a world-conquering monarch. Actually, the text calls it a seed of merit, combining two different agricultural metaphors, that of roots and seeds, but Buddhists always seem to have a problem with their agricultural metaphors, mixing them shamelessly. Yet the term mula also refers to one's capital or financial principle. To use a most certainly false cognate, mula here is really the mula, Jaya's bank of virtue that allows him to cash in for a fervent aspiration. Second, the recipient of one's offerings is important. Jaya gives and as a result receives, yet the rate of return is exceptionally good, universal monarchy for handful of dirt, because the recipient of his offering is the Buddha, who is an excellent field of merit, punyakshetra, in which to plant merit seeds. Third, the value of the object that is given is important. Though one might not know it from this story, nevertheless, the Mahayana Sutra on the topic of giving simply lists 37 gifts and their result, with no mention made of the proper intention or recipient. For example, number 10, he gives a gift of food that results in his being free from the cravings of hunger. Number 11, he gives a gift of drink that results in his being free from thirst everywhere in all his lives yet to come. Buddhist materials often minimize the value of one or more of these variables as a way of emphasizing the worth of the other or others. In the story of Chandraprabha, for example, an evil Brahmin asks King Chandraprabha for his head, so the king decapitates himself and offers his severed head to the Brahmin. The value of the offering is negligible. The Brahmin, after receiving the king's head, simply tosses it aside, unsure of what to do with it. The field of merit constituted by the recipient is also negligible. It's a barren field for sowing seeds of virtue. What is emphasized, however, is the power and propriety of the king's intention. Good donors have good dispositions in general and good intentions when they make offerings. The importance of good intentions, as opposed to offerings with great use value, is shown quite graphically in an episode from the story of a woman dependent on a city for alms. In the story, a leprous beggar woman wandering for alms happens to see the Venerable Mahakashyapa, who instills faith through his body and through his mind, and decides to make him an offering. Here's an excerpt from the story. Then the Venerable Mahakashyapa, understanding her thoughts with his mind, held out his begging bowl. "If you have anything to spare, my sister, please put it in my bowl." Cultivating faith in her mind, she poured some rice water into his bowl. Then a fly fell in. She began to take it out when one of her fingers fell into the rice water. She reflected, although the noble one, out of respect for my feelings, hasn't thrown this rice water away, he won't partake of it. Then the Venerable Mahakashyapa, understanding her thoughts with his mind, right before her eyes, sat down against the base of a wall and began to eat. She reflected, although the noble one, out of respect for my feelings, has partaken of this, he won't think of this food as a proper meal. And as the mendicant that he is, he only eats one meal a day, so this is his one chance for a dinner. Then the Venerable Mahakashyapa, understanding her thoughts, said this to that woman who was dependent on the city for alms: "Sister, I am happy. I can pass the whole day and night on the food that you have given me." She became very excited. "The noble Mahakashyapa has accepted alms from me." Then, while cultivating faith in her mind for the Venerable Mahakashyapa, she died and was reborn among the gods in the heaven known as Tushita, contented. If the leprous beggar woman's offering of rice water with finger were to be judged by its use value, even though Mahakashyapa managed to make a meal of it, she no doubt would have earned very little merit. With the enumeration of offerings and their rewards in the previously mentioned Mahayana Sutra on the topic of giving as a benchmark, an offering of some rice water wouldn't merit rebirth among the Tushita gods. While the woman may have been one small offering away from attaining the karmic threshold that would allow her such an auspicious rebirth, the emphasis here is on how faith can elevate even a mundane offering into something, karmically speaking, very valuable. Guests offer the devotee an amazing opportunity. While Mahakashyapa received a meal, the leprous beggar woman secured for herself a place in heaven. The donor, as such, is the biggest beneficiary. Mahakashyapa gave her the gift of being able to give to him. Giving, as such, is its own reward, especially if one gives out of faith and/or gives to a worthy recipient. To whom then should one make offerings? Basically everyone, for one never really knows what kind of person one stands before, whether the beggar in your presence is a thief or a saint or a god. For example, later in the story of a woman dependent on a city for alms, Shakra, the lord of the Tristrimsha gods, hears that the leprous beggar woman, as a result of her offering, has been reborn in the Tushita heaven, one heaven above his, and he gets jealous. There's a kind of hierarchy of heavens, and she somehow manages to be reborn above him. As it's said in the stories, gods can look down on the world, but they can't look up. And when she's reborn, he looks all through the heavens and hells. He looks everywhere for her, and he can't see her, and kind of freaks out. So he goes to the Buddha and says, "Where is this woman?" And he's like, "Oh, she got reborn in the heaven one above yours," and he is jealous. He tries to entice Mahakashyapa, Shakra that is, whom he knows likes to give the gift of receiving alms from the poor, to accept his offering as well, so that he too can achieve a large reward of merit. Shakra, we are told, magically created a dilapidated, broken down house in which crows lurked on a road where poor people lived. Then he magically transformed himself into a weaver, dressed in hempen rags and wearing a rumpled turban with cracked hands and feet. Even gods can be beggars, and vice versa. This past week in one of my classes, I was screening a film on hijras, members of a third gender on the subcontinent, whose repertoire of behaviors blurs the distinctions between man and woman, Hindu and Muslim. Though they are social outcasts in many ways, shopkeepers routinely give them alms, in part because hijras are thought to have the power to bless and curse, but for other reasons as well. In response to the question of why he gives alms, one shopkeeper in the film explains, "You never know what external form souls will take when they appear before you." There's one all of us sort of paused at. A hijra might be a god too. For a person of faith, the chance to make an offering to a guest is a tremendous opportunity to earn merit and plant new roots of virtue. And so one must treat the atiti, the guest, as a god, offering him whatever one can. The very last morsel of food in one's possession, as the Buddha advises, some rice water, if that's all that one has, even if one is leprous and one's finger might fall in, or a handful of dirt, with the hope that it will suffice by dint of a good disposition, faith, and some wishful thinking, as a handful of barley meal. Hospitality is a very effective way to progress on the spiritual path. Hospitality of this kind, it should be noted, continues to be an important concern and practice for both Buddhists and Indians. Recently, the government of India's Ministry of Tourism has taken up the saying, Atiti Devo Bhavaha, and introduced the Atiti Devo Bhavaha program. According to their website, yes, atitidevobhavaha.com, quote, "The concept guest as God is deep-rooted in modern progressive India. Even the government of India believes in the concept." Considering the enormous number of migrants that attempt to flee persecution and inequity each year, I can only hope that more countries come to believe in the concept as well, greeting and welcoming those on the move, even those dressed as beggars who arrive at inopportune times. That would truly make the world a better place. Thank you very much.
So absorbed in listening, I forgot I was supposed to listen. Thank you very much. When Richard wrote me and asked me to chair this panel, and he told me who was talking, I saw the name John McCraskey, and I thought, well, that's familiar, but why do I know it? And I looked around the room, and there on my bedside was a book. It was a book I'd been reading without really bothering to look at the author. Called, let me get this right, Awakening Through Love, isn't that right? Yes. And it's a wonderful book. John manages to take very recondite and complex tradition from Tibetan Buddhism and reimagine it and retranslate it in both elegant and useful ways. So it's a book that I've learned a lot from, and I'm very appreciative. John is Associate Professor of Buddhism and Comparative Theology here at Boston College, and he's also Senior Advisor to the Kathmandu University Center for Buddhist Studies in Nepal. He is the co-chair of the Buddhist Critical Constructive Reflection Group in the American Academy of Religion, and an instructor in their summer seminar on religious pluralism and comparative theology. He is also the co-founder and guiding meditation teacher of the Foundation for Active Compassion, which brings contemplative training to people who work in areas of social service and social justice. So I'm very pleased to introduce John.
Thanks so much, Larry, and thank you, Andy, for that wonderful paper. And also, happily and coincidentally, because we didn't really consult on it, I think I just want to point out that Andy has covered a number of really fundamental dimensions of early Buddhism and the whole history of Buddhism in India. And Andy's a rare expert in the narrative literature and stories of Buddhism that we've heard not nearly as much from as we have Buddhist philosophical writing. So really recommend you watch for his writings. I recommend them all over the place, and he has a new book coming out soon, which is called Thus Have I Seen.
Visualizing Faith in Early Indian Buddhism.
Visualizing Faith in Early Indian Buddhism. I love that, Visualizing Faith. So please watch for that book. But happily then I'll be covering other kinds of things which will be a bit more philosophical, and also telling stories mainly from a different tradition, Zen tradition. And I'm going to be speaking, I have to locate myself a little bit in order for you to contextualize what I'm going to say, but I'm actually going to be speaking directly from my own tradition of study and practice within Tibetan Buddhism, called Tibetan Nyingma tradition, or the school of the ancient translations of Tibet. I want to begin by something that came up when I was in the bathroom with Andy. I mean, we were, I was just observing how blessed urinals are, because they signal to me that I'm in a men's room, and I often find myself in public men's rooms, and then suddenly I think, I'm not sure what I'm in. Is it, my gosh, it's going to be the women's room. And then I look around for urinals, and so there's this great blessing, this great offering. And it reminded me of something that actually happened with my two teenage sons in tow when we stopped at one of those rest stops on the turnpike. As typically happened, I'm lost in my thoughts, and I'm walking toward what I thought was the men's room, and there's this woman there, and she turns around a little bit surprised, and looks at me and starts signaling me to leave, and I looked at her and I thought, how strange, a woman in the men's room. And I was about to, explain to her that, you're very confused. And then luckily, I thought to look around the room, and no urinals. And then I noticed that there's these other women around the room. And I thought, well, that's really odd. It's odd. And then it dawned on me, of course. Also, my teenage sons by that time, who were behind me, were saying, Dad? So it gradually dawned on me that my perception that these women were the stranger here, that this was not their true home, it was my home. What were these women doing here? They're strangers here, was a completely false perception, yet it looked absolutely true to me when I first walked in. And that's what I want to talk about for a few minutes. My focus would be on the title of the guest book project that Richard Carney has founded here, called Hosting the Stranger. As Richard mentioned yesterday in the opening session, he said the project which this conference is part of concerns the Latin root is hostis, which can have the meaning of a stranger who may either be enemy or a guest. And in this way, then, Richard was saying that it implies a risk to offer hospitality to the stranger, and therefore hospitality implies a risk, a wager, as to how hospitality could be wrestled out of hostility. I think Richard said this kind of thing yesterday. It really struck me. And so I'd like you, as silly as it may sound, to remember that image of me walking into this room, which was obviously to me the men's room, and seeing one woman. She's the stranger here. This is my home. And then seeing other women, and still, how strange. What are all these women doing? They must be so confused. And then suddenly, and also hearing my sons behind me say, Dad, and then it suddenly starts to dawn on me that I'm completely in a false world. There's another story I'd like to tell to get us into Buddhist issues and philosophical principles around the notion of stranger and hosting the stranger. And that's a story I like to tell in classes frequently, which is the story of Kisa Gotami. And I'll just tell it very briefly, but basically, perhaps many of you have heard, it's one of the most famous stories in Asian Buddhist traditions. That's the story of a young woman who's desperately trying to have a child, at the time of the Buddha. And finally, she manages to have a young son and is absolutely overjoyed, just loves the son, and is so excited to finally have given birth after trying for so long, which also establishes her place and her position as a lady in society. But then the child becomes quickly very ill and one day dies as an infant. And she absolutely just cannot face that this has happened. She goes somewhat insane, implied in the story, because she starts walking through the village with the corpse of her dead child on her hip, carrying him as if he's still alive, and asking each person she meets, do you have medicine for my son? And after doing this for some time in the village, finally an old man takes pity on her and says there's there's someone reputed to be a great sage, the Buddha, who is teaching nearby. Why don't you go to see him? Perhaps he can help you. So she rushes off to find the Buddha, Gautama, and he is there teaching his community, monks and nuns. And Gautami rushes up to him, looking kind of disheveled, with the dead body of a child on her hip. She must have looked quite a sight. And says, please, blessed one, Bhagavan, can you please give me medicine for my child? And surprisingly, the Buddha smiles at her and says, Gautami, you've come to the right place. Here's what you should do. Go back to your village, and at each home where the people in that home are not grieving over someone who has died, collect a mustard seed and bring all those mustard seeds back to me. So Gautami is very excited, very, very joyous, because in ancient Indian understanding in that place and time, the implication of the Buddha's words to her would be that if she just will go and collect these mustard seeds, and this is a great, powerful, magically powerful sage who can make some kind of a potion out of this mustard material that perhaps could bring her child back. So she rushes off to her village and she goes to the first home and says, please give me mustard seed. Just tell me that you're not grieving over someone who has died. And the householder says, alas, Gautami, but we are grieving over my father who died last year. She goes to the next house. Please, the Blessed One has told me to collect mustard seeds. Give me a mustard seed. Just tell me that you're not grieving over someone who's died. Alas, Gautami, but our dear daughter died 6 months ago, and we're very much grieving over her. Every day we think of her. She goes to the next house. Please give me mustard seeds. And at every house in the village, every single house, she's unable to collect a single mustard seed. Suddenly it dawns on Gautami that this is what all the people around her have been going through. This tremendous grief from loss, from living and dying, this inevitable grief of loss and detachment. And she comes to this vivid recognition that this is indeed what all beings are going through, that she is not unique. And the very interesting statement comes in one version of the story at this moment. She says, this is what the Blessed One in his compassion has seen. So suddenly in that moment, she has seen the world, for a moment, the way the Buddha sees it. So she comes to, therefore, this profound recognition that, and perhaps enabled, in fact, by the intensity of her grief, that her grief actually is, the meaning of it, the implication of it is not what she had thought at all, that the implication of it is that she is understanding through personal experience what all beings are going through. So she consigns her child to the funeral pyre, she returns to the Buddha, and as the Buddha sees her coming, again he smiles and he says, so, Gautami, have you brought me your mustard seeds? And Gautami says, oh, Blessed One, I've had enough of mustard seeds, just give me refuge. And she becomes one of the great figures, actually, legendary figures in the early Buddhist community, very quickly, perhaps because of the intensity of how her path unfolded under the Buddha's instruction, taking refuge in the Buddha and his teaching and the community, and quickly ascending through the path and becoming an arhat, and is one of the great female figures in the early Buddhist tradition. One implication, it seems to me, of Kisa Gautami's story is that there was a need for her to recognize how all the others around her, and this is also explicit in the story, all the others around her, without exception, all the other beings around her are not strangers. That in the most important way, they are exactly the same as her, and indeed, what she has been going through is a window into what the beings all around her are. So first is her recognition that what had seemed like just a secondary world of strangers compared to her and her intense story turns out not to be a world of strangers at all. That's one thing she recognized. Another thing is within that recognition, recognizing how estranged she had become from herself or from her deeper capacity of knowing. And it was necessary to recognize how others are not strangers to her, in some sense part of her own greater family, as close to her as her child, in some sense. Not in all senses, but in some sense. That had to be recognized in order for her to come into a recognition of a part of herself that was not so strange to her. And in that recognition, a kind of a depth of compassion and wisdom, a deeper identity or capacity within her, which is a truer identity of hers, through which she could then bring her child to the funeral pyre. And even her child then needn't be so estranged. She could recognize that he had actually died. She could come then into relationship to him in terms of whatever offerings and prayers would be said in ancient India. These kinds of stories, starting with my encounter with the women's bathroom and going on to much more lofty things, but these stories raise the question, which I think is a very Buddhist kind of philosophical question: why should anyone look like a stranger to us, given the reality? Why? I think this is a Buddhist question because, by and large, I think in most societies and traditions and disciplines, we just assume, of course, that others ought to look like strangers to us because, by and large, most of them do. Isn't that obvious? But I think this is a kind of peculiar Buddhist question being raised by these stories, is that why should these people look like strangers to us, so much like strangers, as if they weren't intimately familiar to us in a certain sense, that is, that they all have this deep desire to be well, to be happy, just like we do, that they're all going through the anguish, actually, of life and death and loss and grief, of all the ones that are closest to them over the course of their life. Each one will lose everything and everyone that they are holding on to, just like I will. Isn't that obvious? Why should they all look so strange to us as strangers? Isn't that bizarre? Why should that be? This is where I'm going to speak briefly from my own tradition, drawing a little bit on the philosophy of the Tibetan Nyingma tradition. What I'm going to say, though, is very much in common also with many other Buddhist traditions, particularly Mahayana ones, such as Zen. And that is that we are, or people are, alienated from ourselves and others because we are alienated from the ground of our being. Well, that sounds very substantialistic, and which sounds like Paul Tillich. Except what I'm translating as the ground of our being is total groundlessness. To say that we are alienated from the ground of our being is to say that here are ground of our being. It's my way of translating dharmadhatu, and also tatata, suchness, or thisness, or thusness. The ground of our being here is understood as total groundlessness, complete and total insubstantiality and ungraspability, infinite openness, emptiness, and also unobstructed awareness is the very ground of our being. So I'm speaking from within my tradition. The pre-conceptual nature of reality, before our minds even have time to construct a more limited and finite frame of reference, is unobstructed awareness and infinite openness. Before we even have time to make anything up about self versus other, or my little world, which is bordered in this way, like by these walls or whatever, or boundaries, before our minds even have time to think that up, the fundamental ground, a priori ground of our experience is literally, speaking from my tradition, unobstructed awareness and infinite openness, undivided, like the sky flooded with sunlight, the sunlit aspect, and the total openness and unobstructedness aspect are undivided. And within that undivided, groundless ground of openness and pure awareness is a tremendous potential and capacity of compassion and love and creativity and courage and so forth. And that vast potential or capacity that is given within the very ground of our being, before we have time to think up how we're not those things, is, when characterized as the deepest nature of persons, referred to as Buddha nature, Tathagarbha, in Tibetan Dejin Shekpe Ningbo, or our primordial goodness. However, something in our minds that have a great deal of difficulty tolerating that fundamental groundlessness, something in our minds has a hard time handling it, that infinite ungraspability, which is the actual reality of the very ground of our experience at every moment. Something in us says, I can't handle this. So there's an attempt within the mind to establish a fixed, stable ground, a ground that we can grasp to. And that is established primarily through the construct of a sense of self in our thoughts. A sense of self which is reified as substantial, graspable, real. Not merely the construct of thought out of the infinite ground of our experience and awareness, not merely an ephemeral construct of thought that's happening moment to moment and changing moment to moment, which is what's actually happening according to this tradition. Not that, but attempting in the mind constantly to create out of whatever situation we're encountering a very narrow, substantial, real sense of self that we can cling to. And around that is arranged our world, conceptualized world of friends, those who seem to support that sense of self as very real, very substantial, our enemies, those who seem to undercut it or challenge it in some way, and our strangers, which is the vast, vast majority of the world. Out of all the beings in the world, billions and billions, not only human, but animal, insect, etc., almost all of them are strangers. And this is the conceptual construct of our minds. So we're getting back to the story of Kisagotami. How could this be? How did this happen? When it's so obvious how much the same we are in some of the most important ways. Not all ways, but certainly some of the most important ways, existentially. It's so obvious that we're so much the same. Why should we view each other as strangers in the way we do? And this is a Buddhist epistemological analysis of how that happens. And it happens moment by moment. Therefore, from this point of view, everyone is rendered a stranger, everyone, insofar as we mistake our thoughts of persons for the full reality of persons. And we're doing it all the time, by the way. For example, I don't want to freak you out, but just look around the room. How many of these people do you know well? To what extent is each of us mistaking our thought, our label of the person, every other person in the room, for the person? Isn't that how we react to each other? As if the label or thought in our mind of what the other person is the person, and then we react. And not just the people that we haven't been introduced to, but also the people that we think we know well. To what extent have we been doing that every day and every part of every day, mistaking our limited thought of the person, which is very much related to our own sense of self, and what we need the other person to be to us in order to support this reified sense of self. To what extent, even with people closest to us, have we mistaken our thought of them all along, moment by moment, for the fullness of the person, without noticing? In this sense, everyone is rendered a stranger. And we come back to the Kisagotami story with that sense. She was unaware that the people around her were ones that were worthy of deep, deep care. Not because they aren't worthy of that, but because of the habits of thought. So everyone is rendered a stranger by mistaking our thoughts for the persons, even though in the deeper truth, according to this philosophical understanding, in actuality, no one is a stranger, in the sense that all are the same in the most fundamental ways. That is, the goodness of their very being as expressions of their primordially pure ground of infinite openness and pure awareness, and tremendous potential within that. All of the same in that fundamental way of the goodness of the very being, what a Catholic might call the dignity of each person. They're all the same in that. All of us are the same in our habits of delusive thought that alienate us from that ground and from each other. We're all the same in that, what a Catholic would call our sinful condition. And all of us are the same in our deep inner need to be reunited compassionately with ourselves and with others within that ground, within the very ground of our being. All of us have that deep inner need from this philosophical perspective. We're all the same in that. These are the most fundamental ways, aspects of our being, and so therefore the most fundamental aspects of our being. No one is a stranger. Everyone we encounter is an expression of this, just like oneself. And yet our habits of thought and reaction hide both of those truths, the extent to which our own patterns of thinking are rendering everyone a stranger, and the extent to which everyone, in the deeper truth of things, is not a stranger. Both those truths are hidden by our habits of thinking and reaction almost every moment. And this would be a Tibetan Nyingma diagnosis of the fundamental human problem that we find ourselves in. In light of this, the purpose of Buddhist practices, like ritual practices and meditational practices and philosophical analyses and phenomenological investigations and so forth, the purpose of these practices fundamentally is to help release the grip of self-centered projections, to help the person release and relax into the infinite ground of being, infinite expansive openness and awareness, beyond clinging, beyond grasping, so as to know self and others preconceptually, even prior to thinking, and knowing them preconceptually prior to thinking in a way that can also hold them in and through thinking. To know them preconceptually through that undivided ground of openness and awareness, which is to know them automatically with eyes of compassion, which is what Kiskotami fell upon when finally, through the intensity of her grief, the structures of her clinging and grasping to self and others as estranged from the ground of being could just collapse. And for a moment, the knowing could happen through the very ground of being. And with that is automatically a flash of compassion for how lost we've all been and how much suffering we've all been going through together for it. Compassion for oneself, compassion for all others. I want to tell one more quick story. This one would be the story, one of my favorite ones also for classes. It comes out of Zen tradition, Japanese Zen tradition. But again, as I said, Zen tradition is very close in the ways I'm talking about right now to my own Tibetan Nyingma tradition. And this is the story of a Zen master named Jichiri. It's often story titled Jichiri and the Thief. And the story is that Jichiri was a Zen teacher, and he was at home one day chanting sacred scriptures, Buddhist sutras, in the back room of his apartment when suddenly a prowler broke into his apartment with sword in hand and shouted into the back room where Jichiri was chanting his sutra. He was chanting his sutras as a religious practice. And the prowler shouts, "Give me your money or I'll take your life." And the prowler hears Jichiri from the back room. He's chanting, like this, and then he hears Jichiri shout from the back room of the apartment, "Don't disturb me. You'll find money in the drawer." So the prowler's a little surprised, but he sort of like looks around, and there's some kind of a bureau there. He opens the drawer. There's money in it. He starts rifling through it, taking all the money. And he hears Jichiri's voice shouting from the back room again, in the midst of his recitations. "Don't take it all. I need some for taxes." So, the crowd, okay, right. So he takes virtually all the money. He leaves a few yen for taxes, and he's about to abscond leave the premises, but he opens the door, and then finally hears Chichiri shouting again from the other room, "Don't you thank a person when you receive a gift?" So the prowler says, "Right, okay, thanks." Then he runs out. Well, as the story goes, the prowler was captured, and of course, had committed many other robberies in the area, and was brought to trial. And they called Chichiri to the trial to bear witness. And the judge asked Chichiri, "Can you please bear witness for us, the experience you went through with this man? And could you testify that this man is a thief who stole from you?" To everyone's surprise, including the prowler, in the courtroom, Chichiri declares, "This man is not a thief, at least not as far as I'm concerned. I gave him the money, and he thanked me for it." The last part of the story, the thief is sent off to prison because of many other robberies he committed. But while he's in prison for several years, he reflects deeply on this statement by Chichiri. This man is not a thief, at least not as far as I'm concerned. Which enters him into the question, what am I? Who am I, if not a thief, to this man? And when he comes out of prison, so the story ends, he again visits Chichiri to become his Zen disciple. What's going on in this story? The prowler is, in normal terms, and for the hearer or reader of the story, is a stranger writ large, capital S, right? Even as we were listening to the story, the prowler seemed very much like a stranger to us. So the story is constructed in a way to get us to buy into it, to buy into the construction of stranger that it begins with, which is common to the world. And also an extreme example, we would defend to the death perhaps, the right to see this man as only a stranger to us, or worse, an enemy. When the prowler walked into the room, his behavior connotes that he assumed that he had a fixed identity. His self was a thief self, reified and substantial, to which he clung, and everything else was interpreted in terms of. Remember what I said earlier, philosophically. In accord with the construct, this attempt in the mind to construct a reified and substantial self comes a projection of an entire world, which is defined in its relation to how well it helps support that construct or undercut it. So to this man who grasps to himself as a substantial thief with that identity, with that essence, unchangingly, and the other person in the room could only be a victim. The thing that's strange about the story, almost from the beginning, from like the second line on, when Chichiri says, "Don't disturb me," as if they have a relationship. You'll find the money in the drawer. From that moment, there's something strange about the story, and it's already connoting or indicating that Chichiri does not accept this man's construct. Chichiri lives in a different world. Chichiri's responses imply that the worldly identities of a sort that the thief is clinging to are impoverished constructs, they are distorted habits of thought, and they capture no one's true identity, although we live them as if they did, all of us, almost all the time. They don't capture the potential and dignity of the underlying nature of anyone, oneself or others. Therefore, he said in court, he's not a thief, at least not as far as I'm concerned. And there comes the literary trope. It acknowledges that the world would view him as a thief. I acknowledge that. Conventionally, he'd be viewed as a thief, and also viewed as a substantially existent one. One you should hate, for example, because there's nothing else to him but thiefness. But he's not that, as far as I'm concerned, he said. That's the qualifier. So his point of view is different. What is his point of view? To make a long story short, in this Zen tradition, similar to my Tibetan tradition, Chichiri abides in a different dimension of our world. That is, Chichiri is abiding in the ground of being, what I've called this infinite expanse of openness and awareness, which is our preconceptual ground of experience. We all have it, The question is whether we can learn to drop into it, or relax into it, or abide in it. And Jichuri is constructed in the story as someone who abides in it. What does it mean to abide in that grounded being, as opposed to being lost in reactions to reified identities? It means that, remember that grounded being, as infinite openness and pure awareness, contains within it a vast potential. And it means that that vast potential can take expression in spontaneous ways. So that vast potential is one of, first and foremost, compassion, according to the tradition. And so the entire story is one of compassion. Jichuri is communing from his, what we call Buddha nature. His Buddha nature, actualized, Jichuri's, is communing with the unactualized or dormant Buddha nature of the thief, even before anything is said. And everything that is said from Jichuri's side will be a construct now, a reconstructing of identities that reconstructs them in a way that accords with that knowledge from the grounded being, that ultimately, actually, we're undivided, ultimately, in the most fundamental ways. We are identical, and therefore, as we come into our world of manifest and embodied life, the most fundamental level of communication is communing in compassion from through the grounded being itself. In compassion for all of these crazy identities that all of us have been constructing and grasping to and coming into conflict and suffering through for so many lifetimes. So Jichuri says, don't disturb me, you'll find the money in the drawer. Rough, but relational. Authoritative, but also giving permission, like a father to a son who is seeking his allowance. Don't disturb me, you'll find the money in the drawer. Don't take it all, I need some for taxes. Again, an amount set by mutual need and obligation, as in a family. Don't you thank the person when you receive a gift? Again, like a gruff father who needs to train an immature child who will suffer for not having been so trained. Training skill in the skills that the child needs for his own well-being. Jichuri has reconstructed the identities not as victim and thief, but as father to son and teacher to disciple, and he has done that years before the thief realizes that that's what's happened. But eventually the thief catches on. After all, the thief also has Buddha nature, and it's a Buddha nature or an inner capacity of knowing, preconceptual capacity of knowing, that was already spoken to and evoked, and which could then come to conscious awareness over time. So just to repeat the principle that's illustrated in the story, it says Jichuri is more in touch with the other person than the person himself because he's in touch with the other through the ground of his being. And notice this other important point, because I think it came up in Richard's seminar, according to some of the things I've been sent by James, thank you so much, that in reading those articles and some of the discussions, there's a certain concern there that comes up in this story, which is, notice in the story that the movement of the universal to the particular, that is, Jichuri's knowledge of the thief's Buddha nature, which is universal knowledge, the nature of mind that all persons share, takes expression in very particular responses that speak through the particulars of the thief's conditioned mind to his underlying Buddha nature. So to know the other through the ground of his being, which is a universal reality, doesn't lead to some vague inability to respond in very specific ways, but somehow is understood to unleash the power to respond in very specific ways, to unleash more of the power to respond more fully present, more fully aware of all the details of what it is you're responding to. And this actually gets formalized in Mahayana Buddhist systems in the description of enlightenment in terms of 4 aspects of a Buddha's wisdom, which Jichuri is illustrating in the story. What's called mirror wisdom, which is the wisdom or the awareness which is simply totally open to everything that is appearing, reflecting it like a mirror. And then there's the wisdom of sameness, which recognizes the insubstantial, groundless nature of the experience, all experience. Wisdom of the same, all experiences are the same in that insubstantial groundlessness. And then there's discriminating wisdom, which is through that openness to what is attentive to and aware of each of the particular details. And then comes the 4th aspect of wisdom, ascribed to a Buddha in Mahayana, treatises, which is all-accomplishing wisdom, which means now can come the response that is very specific, right to the specifics of the circumstances as they're called for by that situation. So that's basically what I wanted to present, some of these issues that are raised by the question of stranger and what is a stranger and why should there even be any strangers from a certain angle. So I hadn't heard that question raised before, but for some reason it occurs to me from within this tradition it would be the natural question to raise. Why should anybody be a stranger to us given the reality? And how can we get lost from that reality in the way that we have? And how can we come back to it? And the stories actually, to me, are also an example of a practice. It was a particular practice. It was looking for mustard seeds in your village. Most of us probably are not assigned that practice when we connect with Buddhist traditions. But the point is that that's a tale of practice through which, as an example of how somebody, how human beings can be helped to come back to recognition of the very ground of their being that's prior to all the lostness that we've been going through together. Finally, this last thing, just a quick observation, it concerns encountering the religious other, because that was a topic of the conference. And on one hand, a religious other, somebody who is of another religious tradition, is a stranger like any other stranger in the conventional world as we experience it. And the apparent strangeness of the religious other would be analyzed the same way by a Buddhist philosopher as any other kind of strangeness. The religious other is the same in the most important ways in their deep nature and capacity and their wish for happiness and their tendencies toward delusion. But on the other hand, the appearance of the religious other creates a special problem that other kinds of strangers do not generate. Because historically, the religious other is also one who tends to assert in one form or another a substantial self or soul or God. You see the problem? Precisely that which is the root of our suffering tends to be asserted in Buddhist philosophical understanding, in some ways, philosophically, by other religious traditions. And thereby, in the name of saving persons from the roots of evil and suffering, other religious traditions have been traditionally viewed in Buddhism as promulgating beliefs that intellectually reinforce the roots of evil and suffering unawares. So, this also has historical issues that in the face of non-Buddhist traditions of India and East Asia over history that have sought to conquer Buddhism in a sense by proving it wrong. You Buddhists are nihilists or atheists, there is a God, there is a soul, etc., philosophical debate, by proving it wrong, or other non-Buddhist traditions that have sought to absorb Buddhism by declaring it not different, which is not uncommon actually in some Hindu traditions. And therefore, in the face of that historical reality, Buddhists have felt the need to articulate their teachings as both valid and distinctive, not the same as others. And there's a lot at stake in that from a Buddhist point of view, that ongoing debate regarding both the ultimate welfare of persons, that's what's at stake, not just defense of your own ground, but the ultimate welfare of persons. Where do the deepest roots of suffering, not even conscious to us, lie? That matters, and it matters to get clear on it. And also the survival, of course, of Buddhist institutions and societies in history. This is a very historical problem for Buddhists. However, with the proper caution around those very real issues, I think the religious stranger might also be viewed as an agent of revelation for Buddhists by raising up for us Buddhists our own reified identities and attachments around Buddhism that we're otherwise not conscious of, and our Buddhist forms and institutions. Part of the Buddhist diagnosis is that we Buddhists also are doing that like crazy and in ways we're mostly not conscious of. And who can bring that to our consciousness except the religious other? Really no one else. We are utterly dependent on the religious other for that, according to our own diagnosis. Another aspect is that religious others could be seen as ones who, in their own religious ways, become receptive to the qualities of the very ground of being. After all, it's the ground of our being, not just the Buddhists. And that they have their own intensive modes of focus, as Mark Heim has theorized in some of his writing, through which other various aspects of the ground of being that Buddhists are also trying to become receptive to are engaged in even more intensive ways by elements of people in other religious traditions. So seen in that way, the spiritual insights, at least of profoundly formed religious others, could also be received as revelation which has something fresh and new to offer to Buddhists, precisely because it is revealed by those who are religiously other. Thank you.
Thank you both for absolutely wonderful talks. And we have some time for questions. Yes.
I have a quick comment and then a question. Your story, John, wonderful story about the tree and the thief reminded me of perhaps the universality of the story in that Victor Hugo in Les Miserables tells a very similar story about the Bishop of Digne, who is robbed by Jean Valjean, who is his guest. He welcomes him into the house when nobody else will welcome into any house in Digne. And he's got the yellow card of the criminal, having escaped from prison in Marseille. And the bishop welcomes him in and takes out the best, silverware for his guest. Even though the maid is quite unhappy about this. And so they go off to bed, and Jean Valjean gets up, steals candleware and everything else, and disappears with money. And the police bring him back, and the bishop is called to verify the fact that this man has stolen, and he says, no, I gave him the money, and in fact, he was my guest, and he forgot something, and he goes and gets the silver candlesticks and says, take these as well. And of course, it profoundly changed the self-understanding of Jean Valjean, as in your story, which does suggest maybe that in these different stories, in Victor Hugo's case, it's from a Christian tradition, or a Judeo-Christian tradition. In your case, it's from a Zen tradition. But that these narratives may, in fact, be tapping into something that is pretty universal about transforming the thief into a non-thief by seeing something deeper in them than their mere act. Sort of separating the agent from the act, as it were, and seeing that from the point of view of the ground of their being, they're different. But if I just play devil's advocate at another level, about trying to live from the ground of our being, because at one level, if you walked into that restaurant and said we're all the same, there's no stranger, there's no other,
Yeah.
then you could have urinated against the wall and not even knowing you were doing something inappropriate, right?
Yeah, don't think I haven't accidentally. Yeah, go ahead. You don't want to get into
So
that.
the difference between, at a very basic level, they're just gender and appropriateness, right?
Yeah.
It's a very anecdotal example, but it's also kind of telling. We do have to recognize differences of gender just in that. But coming back to the thief, I mean, that's a wonderful story, it seems to me, about how we should see beyond appearances too. But the hard cases, and I know Buddhists have thought a lot about this, but in the case of a murderer, a child molester, a rapist, a Nazi SS officer, it's much harder to say, to see them as a stranger, a criminal, is a superficial way of viewing them, because viewed from the ground of their being, they're actually good people. And, I'm kind of persuaded to believe that's true, but it's very difficult.
Yeah. You want me to speak to that?
Yeah.
Well, first, just two quick things. I mean, one was that in the story of Jichiri, I really wanted to point this out because I know it came up in your seminar. Notice the specificity of Jichiri's responses. Jichiri did not urinate on the wall or just sit there chanting in some, his eyes just vague and, oh, it's all one. Not at all. Actually, the power of the story is in the specifics and the particularity of his responses. So that this is really an assertion that to commune with others through the very ground of our being, which I think is one way of just summarizing what the fundamental practices are trying to help people catch on to. Communing with others from the very ground of our being, even pre-verbally, before anybody says or thinks anything, or even in and through what's said and thought, takes expression in extremely specific ways, which have a certain discernment and wisdom to them precisely because they are the expression of communing with others through the very ground of being, which otherwise wouldn't be possible because we're so distracted and lost in our own self-focused images and impressions of others that don't capture anywhere near enough of the reality. That in order to capture much more of the reality of whoever it is that we are encountering, we'd have to be much more stripped down to the very ground of our being, because otherwise we're just not taking in nearly enough of the data, if you will. So I think one very important message of the story, maybe the most important I would want to emphasize here, of Jichiri, is the specificity of the responses. And that's the story of the bishop that you were telling. We'd have to, that also, I think its real power would be in all the specifics, not only the fact that it's a similar general pattern, but the similarity, though, you're right, is absolutely telling that yes, from a Buddhist perspective of the particular tradition I'm talking from, we're talking about the very ground of our being that we all share, that we're all an expression of. And so it makes absolute sense that others who are profoundly formed, most profoundly formed from within their own tradition, if their tradition really has merit, that indeed that's exactly what's happening. They are being conformed to the very ground of their being, as we would say in Buddhism. You notice I never said the word God. The word God from a Buddhist perspective, and this isn't really meant as a criticism, because, let me put it this way. The word God from one perspective coming from Buddhism is a distraction. Because why not just be? Why do we have to talk about someone that we're supposed to be relating to? Why not learn how to just be as simply as possible? And that may have something to do with what it means to come into more intimacy with God, as that's usually phrased. But from another perspective coming from Buddhism, and this is very personal, just as it happens, part of the fact that I've been happy to be at Boston College is because every time somebody who's really profoundly formed by Christian tradition or Catholic tradition speaks, like Father Hederman this morning, Catherine has a colleague, not to mention others, it blows my mind. It's as if they're teaching the truths of Buddhism to me, but in such a fresh way. If that makes any sense. Anyhow, so both of these perspectives from Buddhism. Why even bring up God? But on the other hand, as long as it's come up, wow. So then, what was the final point?
Yes, what's the limit of sort of seeing beyond the act?
That's right. That's right. Of course, SS. Right. Oh yes, I hate those SS. So, no, absolutely. I mean, this is very, very serious. It's just that why? How do they? It's very simple, actually. I'm sorry. I'm going to challenge all that. I'm going to say no. It is not difficult. I'm saying it's time to stop agonizing how difficult it is to view the SS with compassion. And I speak as someone born in a Jewish family whose aunt's family was destroyed in the Holocaust. So I mean, that doesn't give me any special privileges. But what I mean is I'm not being superficial, or trying not to be. Why is it, I don't think it's such a big deal to have some compassion, even for the SS. Why? Because how did they become the SS? That's how they became it. So in my book, Awakening Through Love, you might remember this. It sounds like a radical statement, but it is straight Tibetan Buddhism or Zen. The very instant anyone, anywhere, at any time in the world, anywhere, thinks this person does not deserve love, the seed of evil has been planted. We're all engaged in that all the time. Every time we think of somebody as merely a stranger or someone we hate, then we're planting the seed of evil constantly. We're all doing it. And when that gets watered and nurtured enough in social and cultural discourse, it becomes the SS, it becomes Hitler, it becomes the Khmer Rouge, and it becomes Stalin. In the name of ideology and social constructs and understandings, it's given an intellectual form. But the essence of it is an instant that we get fundamentally lost from our very being and think this one does not deserve love. Why? Because we're reacting to our thought of the person, not to the person, and we don't even realize it. Therefore, to declare, as I know it's common to do, it's so hard, for example, to love the SS, etc. Of course, on a human level, that would take a lot of process to get to a point where you can actually hold even someone in the SS, or particularly one in your life that affects your life, in a way that's actually holding them in compassion. But it would be holding them in a kind of compassion that is in full recognition that the entire way that they're thinking and reacting is completely lost from reality. And that may also take very firm measures and firm confrontation. But it would be a firm confrontation out of compassion, and it would have more power for that fact, rather than Gautama. Firm confrontation for compassion, within the tradition I'm speaking from, will have more effect, will be more what you want, than confrontation out of hatred.
Can I jump in with this? Listening to your story, you're talking about his specific response, and what I was hearing was the way he was using skillful means to get to something. That this notion in Buddhism, in addition to compassion and wisdom, is that my job is not to judge the other person or defend myself against the other person, but out of compassion to try to find what is the most skillful way I have to help this person realize his true nature. So the thief or the child molester, my job is not to say he's bad or not to say he should be released where he can molest others, but what can I do at this moment to help that person move forward? And once I ask that question in that operational way, then the whole issue of my feelings about the other person don't come up, because I just assume, and this is especially the Mahayana tradition, I just assume I'm here to help everybody get awakened, right? And once I frame it that way, then I understand my job, right? Which may be, simply to let the other person feel my compassion, or it might be, it seems to me in that story, what's really interesting is he gets the person to say thank you and to leave the money. It's, not only that it's acting as a family, but he's helping the other person do something that's going to help that person, right? Even though that person doesn't understand it in that way at that moment, he is setting up a spiritual opportunity for that person, which will then blossom later on. And that for me is what is so extraordinary about Buddhism, so that when the Dalai Lama says, I think if you're a Christian, you should stay a Christian, you shouldn't become a Buddhist, which is a difficult thing when, as John said, Buddhism on one hand thinks that, the whole structure of deism of theism is a problem. But if you understand it in terms of skillful means, he's saying what's the best way for people to move forward, then it makes perfect sense that he doesn't have to get involved in dictating a certain way of being. Anyway, go ahead.
I was wondering if you could clarify a little bit more what you mean by person, because you've spoken about a self as sort of a false way that prevents us from feeling compassion for other people. And you've spoken about the ground of being as a place where persons meet, in a sense, but you pick up a person still, and I'm wondering what's the difference between self and a person? And I'm coming from a Christian perspective where a person is very important, and I would think a false self is also something you want to get rid of. But God is a person, and other people are persons. So I'd like to know how you understand it from a Buddhist tradition.
Do you want to speak to that first?
Not me.
From, like was said earlier, for every tradition, each tradition is very diverse. I can't speak for all of Buddhism, but I'll draw on some basic principles, and I'll just speak for my own tradition, but these are also pretty foundational principles in many other schools. And that is that, of course, there are persons. The Sanskrit word is purusha. It's used commonly to refer to persons, and persons are very important, like in the story Kispa-to-me. In other words, don't lose the stories. Mm-hmm. The philosophy is meant to help clarify certain key aspects of the stories, but don't lose the stories. Notice how important persons were. Notice how important that thief was to Jichiri. He was risking his life there by barking out these gentle commands. That's how important that thief was to him. Persons are very important. But how are they understood? A person is basically a mind and a body, all the components of the body and all the different components of the mind, upon which is put a label, me or I. The problem is that we have, in our minds, is a tendency to misinterpret that simple label, me or I, as referring to an unchanging substantial entity, somewhere within body and mind. But no such entity exists. The body and the mind are entirely impermanent. But the mere label, me or I, or I'm a doctor, or hi, I'm Professor John McGransky. Nice to meet you. What's your name? These names function. Buddhists also introduce themselves. The names function. They're functional. But the problem is when we tend to mistake the labels and the names or identities for substantial unchanging entities that we're then trying to defend and hold on to. And then the entire world becomes interpreted constantly, every moment, in a way that will help us to defend and hold on to those identities, which then become social identities as well. That's the problem. So this would be one Buddhist way into what Christians would identify as the problem of sinfulness. That humans are at a pre-conscious level are distorted in their judgments and reactions in ways we're not even conscious of. And so that's the Christian doctrine of sinfulness is something about that, because from a Christian perspective, we've fallen away from our Creator, from the very ground of our being, the very source of our being. But from a Buddhist perspective, it comes at it this kind of way.
Yes.
I want to share something and maybe have one or both of you reflect on it, just because I'm hearing some resonances and I want to clarify. So my religious tradition is of the Religious Society of Friends of Quakers. And in our
Please don't beat me up.
our bizarre little sect of the world, our peculiar people, there's this belief in something called continuing revelation, which is to say that revelation in the Christian tradition is true, but it is also unending, so that truth continues to build. And in an operational way, in my the congregation, there was a gentleman who came back in his mid-80s and said, when I was here 40 years ago, I molested all of the children who were here. You might not have known that, but I needed to tell you. By the way, I'm dying, but I'd like to worship with you again. Holy moly, right? So some of those people were still there who had been present to this gentleman. And in a very realistic way, we had to engage in dialogue about, okay, so we talk the talk, but now that we want to reunite with the stranger, we didn't even know was a stranger. I mean, that's the hard part, right? What do we do? And in our tradition, this idea of continuing revelation seems to be very much in line with this. We will name it as best we can, acknowledging that the river continues to rush past. You know, that the water isn't the same, water that it was. We have to keep the same name there, otherwise, I don't know, our whole life falls apart. So, everyone's idea of this man suddenly shifted, turned on a dime in a single day, and so we had to reorient ourselves to the, to the men's room sign, or however you just want to think about it. And so I'm wondering, the question is there a way to continue your phrase, the thoughts of a person? Is there a way to continue to think about a person, but in a loose way? So that you can go about your daily life and go to the store and go shop and do whatever, being willing to have your thoughts shifted, as necessary, or is this all just a game?
It's yours too.
Actually, in each of the Buddhist traditions that we've talked from and about, the core contemplative, the ritual practices and contemplative practices are aiming at something, aiming at some human possibility. And ultimately, in each of these traditions, at least as they're elaborated when adepts are practicing them in their full depth, the human being is helped or guided into a level of experience that is non-conceptual. In other words, I'm speaking to your question. It's not about thinking. It's not about how are we going to be saved or save ourselves by finding the best ways to think about this. This is why also I think it's appropriate for me to be in a theology department teaching about Buddhism, because ultimately it's talking about a dimension of reality that is prior to thinking, that transcends thinking. And it's from that dimension of reality, to whatever degree we become receptive to it or open to it, that dimension of reality is our own deepest reality, to that degree which is pre-conceptual, prior to thinking, prior even to the conceptual division between self and other. From that ground of being, then our thoughts can be profoundly informed. So that it might be possible, again, not being glib, because you raised, like the SS, one of the most terrible, horrible, difficult examples appropriately. A man who has abused children in our own church years ago, and we didn't even know it, now revealing himself. How are we to think about him? The first thing is, how are we to be? So we come back to our being. Now, then it becomes this very interesting problem that you're raising. how is this deep from the ground our very ground, this intrinsic sense of intimacy, even undividedness, with this horrible monster, as we would tend to think. How can that be reconciled with the realities of what he has done and what has to now happen in this community? And that, the Jishri story is a very idealized kind of example, but it's sort of like a North Star. It's like a pointer on the map. So there's a possibility there. Maybe in the intimacy of the very ground of our being, there can be more and more of a sense of the fuller and fuller humanity of that man and what everybody else is agonizing through, that even understands a little bit how people can go off into such crazy, harmful directions for themselves, for all others, even prior to judgment, can understand that a little bit. And from that place, also confront things that need to be confronted, speak truthfully in ways that need to be spoken, not gloss over things, because of the sort of courage of just coming from the nakedness of you're not, in speaking to that man, you're not, by the fact that he's confessing it, something new is happening here. Can we recognize that? And is that confession possibly part of a process in which he's increasingly becoming more fully present to more of what he is, from which he'd been so lost? And is this basically a gift from God? Are we the hosts now? And God has appeared in this form. It's too easy to say, well, I would never crucify Jesus. I would have known that he's a very saintly being. But now this man has appeared. Even for Quakers, this is hard to handle. What could be a better gift from God than this?
I just finished teaching Macbeth, and it's a play in which the most monstrous man is also the deepest, most sympathetic human being. And that's one of the functions of art, is about intimacy. And at the end of the discussion, one of the students said, I just get frustrated because I come in with questions and I just leave with more questions about this person. And I said, you don't leave with more questions, you leave with a much broader, deeper, more intimate knowledge of another human being. And you let go of your need to reduce that person to one thing, but you try to hold it all in some way. And art, we haven't spoken a lot about that, but art is deeply about these problems in the sense that it offers us a way to get past this naming process to encounters with the full complexity of life in a sort of simple, emotional, and deep way. It's a skillful means. So we walk away. In the play, Macbeth doesn't get all free. His head gets chopped off, But we also have a deep experience of human suffering. And that is enormously beneficial, I think. And we have to wrap it up.
Time for one more question down here?
One last quick one.
Okay, sounds good.
Andrew.
Oh, quick one. I can't do it quick. This is also a question for John. I'm sorry that most questions seem to be coming to you. I just want to try to understand a little better what some of the implications of what you said. You spoke about the Buddhist tradition exhorting us to seek the very ground of being and to do away with constructs. And you even said, we all have constructs of other people in this room sitting around us. And if we truly want to communicate with them, we should do away with these constructs. Well, my question is, don't we need constructs? At least some constructs? You just spoke about Professor Makransky. That's a construct. That's a construct that's absolutely necessary, it seems to me, for you to function in a classroom. Not because you're necessarily better or worse or this or that, or you have more power or less. It's a cultural construct. Without you couldn't exist as you do at Boston College. And more broadly, there is no humanity without a construct.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I don't want you to go on and on misunderstanding what I said. I never said that we should get rid of constructs. there's something that's going wrong in how we encounter our own thoughts of others, unaware that they are not the fullness of others. And making that argument, in other words, when I look around the room, there are a number of people. Hi Karen, hi Chris, hi Eric, see, they're my friends. I know them. And then there are other people, they're just strangers. And the way they look to me, this is a Buddhist analysis, but we have to really get into this. The way the others are looking to me, they're completely strangers to me, are as if they're unimportant. The important ones are over there, because I know them. So anyhow, I mean, look into that, see if that's not the case. The point is that there's something wrong with about how we encounter our own thoughts of others, not recognizing that we're mistaking our own thoughts of them, which are very limited, distorted thoughts, for the actual people, and that's happening almost all the time. That's the point I'm making. Now, don't leap to the conclusion that therefore the argument is, let's get rid of all constructs and names and labels. Not at all. The mere label, here's a person, I think Richard said your name was Peter. Is that right? Or
No,
what's your name?
Anjali.
Sorry?
Anjali.
Anjali. So the fact that you have a name, the fact that you're a man rather than a woman, conventionally, the fact that you're wearing glasses, all those are concepts. The fact that you're in a room and that we're talking, that our concepts are working like mad. And I never would, nor did I ever make an argument that we should get rid of all these concepts.
So maybe the issue is the simultaneity of insight into the depth of a person and the necessity to relate to that person on a social level.
Right, and again, remember the stories. That's why they're so much more helpful than just talking philosophy. Jichiri said, oh, there's money in the drawer, just get it out of there. Leave me a little bit, I need some for taxes. He was in the world of concepts, but he's coming into the world of concepts. He's participating in the world of concepts from a dimension of his being beyond concepts. But coming from a dimension of his being beyond concepts does not mean he's not participating in the world of concepts, that he's not affirming concepts as useful. Indeed, what happened for that thief could not have happened without the usefulness of concepts. Concepts were absolutely essential to it. So that's not being denied at all, and they certainly shouldn't be done away with. And indeed, if anybody had any inkling of anything meaningful in anything I said or Andy said, it's because of the use of concepts, which is the tradition of Buddhism. Studies and debate and learning are absolutely critical, or there's no coming aware of anything, because that's the world we live in.
It's about knowing what's important in a concept and not overusing it. I know you're a man, but if that's the only important thing about you, then I'm lost. I know he's a professor, but that's only a certain kind of usefulness and not more. We really have to stop. But I'm sure people will stay here and talk with you if you want to.